joining us this morning to talk more about the latest cases against the former attorney and how this all could play out. Former FBI Special Agent Stuart Kaplan. As always, thank you. So he's been relocated. He's now at McCormick. It's in Georgia, at the Georgia-South Carolina border. Reason for this type of move? Why would they do this?
And good morning to you, Marni. Most correctional facilities are not set up or designed to house prisoners permanently in protective custody. This facility, McCormick, does have a separate unit where it can house up to 25 prisoners specifically identified as necessary to keep them basically on lockdown in protective custody. And that is why they moved him for trying to ensure his safety.
And why is he considered an inmate that would need protective custody? I mean, obviously it's a high-profile case, but what else about it would make him a target in prison that he would need to be confined?
Well, interesting enough, Marni, it's ironic because I'm not so sure that the threat is really with respect to someone maybe wanting to act out or some sort of revenge against Alex Murdaugh. I think the judicial system, the correctional system, is very concerned about the liability issue. We have seen all too often, more recently in the last couple of years, I think the most notoriety, most publicized one was that of Jeffrey Epstein. I think the people that are in charge of these correctional facilities are concerned about his safety and don't want to be worried about that something will happen on their watch. And so the easier way, the path of less resistance, is to take someone like Alex Murdaugh and keep him on lockdown in protective custody. This will, it's not a guarantee, will certainly add another layer of security just to protect his personal safety.
So that he does not harm himself. We know the murder for hire plot came out in the trial. His attorneys are going to appeal his double murder conviction and his consecutive life sentences. On what grounds will they do so?
Well, I think obviously there's a big issue with respect to some of the evidence that was introduced at trial. There were several arguments with respect to either there was a violation of the Fourth Amendment with respect to that what was recovered at the scene was a violation of his constitutionally protected right, or that there were issues with respect to things that were overruled at pretrial that then put Alex Murdaugh in a prejudicial state with respect to going forward and the continuation of what they thought was tainted evidence being used and incorporated into the trial. I think the most damning thing was where they were unsuccessful, meaning the defense team was unsuccessful, is you recall they paraded in one witness after the other with respect to talking about his theft, his fraud with respect to what went on in the law firm. I think obviously there was an argument with respect to the relevancy of the introduction of that evidence and obviously the prejudicial effect that it had on Alex Murdaugh. And I think that's going to be probably one of the highlighted issues on appeal.
And based on all of that, same judge that presided over the case, what's the likelihood any of these appeals would be granted?
I think slim to none. I think that the appellate courts will realize that the evidence was overwhelming in favor with respect to his guilt. And I think that there was nothing done that would have risen to the level of quote unquote being reversible error. And so I think that the conviction will be upheld on appeal.
Mentioned this a moment ago, Stuart. There are questions as to whether Murdaugh can even afford any of these appeals. His attorneys have asked for money to be transferred out of the escrow account in connection to the Mallory Beach trial. If that doesn't happen, if they don't get the money, he gets a public defender. How does that move forward?
Yeah, so Alex Murdaugh would then petition the court. He would be required to fill out a financial affidavit, which is done routinely based upon the court's finding and them being satisfied that he does not have the minimal assets to be able to afford a lawyer to perfect his appeal. He would then be appointed a public defender to then file the appeal on his behalf. So if his financial state is zero, he will not be left without representation. He will get a public defender at the taxpayer's cost.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.